The Russian sentence "Они зашагали быстрее" translates to "they started walking faster" or "they began to march faster" in English. Breaking it down, они, they. Zashagали, past tense of zashagat, which means to start walking, marching, implies the action just started. Быстрее, faster. So it conveys that a group of people increased their pace. If you want, I can also explain the nuance of zashagali versus just pashli, another verb for went. It's a subtle but interesting difference. The Russian sentence «В окружности нескольких десятков метров от места приземления яйца не осталось и следа растительности» translates to English roughly as within a radius of several dozen meters from the place where the egg landed, not a trace of vegetation remained. A breakdown. В окружности нескольких десятков метров, within a radius of several dozen meters, от места приземления яйца, from the place where the egg landed. Не осталось и следа растительности. Not a trace of vegetation remained. It implies that whatever egg landed there, it completely destroyed the vegetation in a wide area around it. If you want, I can also explain the nuance of the Russian sentence «Поваленные деревья стали попадаться пришельцам на значительном удалении от корабля» translates to English as fallen trees began to appear to the aliens at a considerable distance from the ship. Breaking it down. Поваленные деревья, fallen trees, стали попадаться, started to appear, started to be encountered. Пришельцам, to the aliens. На значительном удалении от корабля. At a considerable distance from the ship. It suggests that aliens, or extraterrestrials, are noticing fallen trees far from their spacecraft. If you want, I can also The Russian sentence Kiev остановился возле гигантской чинары translates to English as Kiev stopped near the giant plane tree. Kiev, a name, остановился equals stopped, возле, near, beside. Гигантский equals giant, feminine, singular, genitive case to match чинары. Чинары equals plane tree, a type of large tree, often called sycamore in English. So it describes someone named Kiev stopping next to a huge tree. If you want, I can also explain the subtle nuance of возле. The phrase «отливавший желтым металлическим блеском» is in Russian and can be translated literally as «отливавший», gleaming, shining, or reflected, from the verb «отливать», here in a descriptive particle form. Желтым, yellow. Металлическим блеском, with a metallic shine, or with a metallic luster. So the whole phrase would roughly mean gleaming with a yellow metallic shine, or reflecting a yellow metallic luster. It's often used in literature to describe something that looks like gold or brass, catching light with a warm metallic glow. If you want, the Russian phrase «nig взгляни», тебе это ничего не напоминает, translates roughly to «nig, look, doesn't this remind you of something?» Nig, this seems like a name or nickname being addressed. Взгляни, look, or take a look. Тебе это ничего не напоминает. Literally, does this remind you of nothing? Which is an idiomatic way of saying, doesn't this remind you of something? It's essentially someone pointing something out to another person and asking if it seems familiar or evokes a memory. The phrase «обратился он к спутнику» is Russian and translates literally to «he addressed the companion» or «he turned to the companion» in English. Breaking it down, «обратился», past tense of «обратиться», meaning to turn to address, or to speak to. «Он», he, к спутнику, to his companion, where it means to, and спутнику is the dative case of sputnik, companion, fellow traveler, or associate. So in context, it usually implies that he spoke to, asked, or directed something toward his companion. The phrase "nig приблизился к чинаре" is in Russian, but it seems a bit unusual or poetic. Breaking it down, nig. This is not a standard Russian word. It might be a name or a typo. Приблизился means approached or came closer. K means to or toward. Chinare likely refers to chinar, which is a plane tree, a type of large tree in Russian. Chinare is the dative case, so to the plane tree. So literally, it translates to, open quote, Nig approached the plane tree, close quote. Without more context, Nig is likely a proper name. The sentence could be from a story or a poem. The Russian phrase «постучал по ее стволу длинной тонкой трубкой с утолщением на конце» literally translates to knocked on its trunk with a long thin tube that had a thickened end. Breaking it down, «постучал», knocked or tapped, по ее стволу on its trunk. Depending on context, ствол could mean the trunk of a tree, a barrel of a gun, or even a stem. Длинной тонкой трубкой with a long thin tube, с утолщением на конце, with a thickening at the end, or that had a thickened end. The exact meaning of stvol and the object with a thickened end depends on context. It could be literal, tree trunk, or metaphorical, gun barrel, musical instrument, etc. The phrase странная форма is Russian and translates literally to strange shape or strange form in English. Странная equals strange, unusual, odd. Forma equals shape, form, or sometimes uniform, depending on context. So depending on context, it could mean commenting on a weird object or shape, that's a strange shape. Commenting on a uniform or outfit, that's a strange uniform. If you want, I can help figure. The Russian phrase «Если бы это был не минерал, я бы сказал, что он напоминает мне» translates to English as «If this were not a mineral, I would say that it reminds me of». Breaking it down, «Если бы» equals if, introduces a hypothetical situation. «Это был не минерал», this were not a mineral. «Я бы сказал», I would say, «что он напоминает мне», it reminds me of. It's a way of comparing a mineral to something else in appearance, texture, or shape, as if saying, it looks like if it weren't a mineral. If you want, I can also suggest a natural way to phrase it in casual English so it sounds more. The Russian phrase «посмотри кругом» literally translates to look around in English. «Посмотри», imperative form of look, telling someone to look. «Кругом» means around or all around. So it's used when you want someone to observe their surroundings or take a look in all directions. If you want, I can also explain. The Russian phrase «Да ведь таких камней очень много» translates roughly to «but there are so many stones like that», or «but there are lots of stones like that». Breaking it down, «да», «but», or an emphatic particle like «well». Ведь emphasizes the statement like «after all» or «you see». Таких камней, stones like that. Literally, of such stones. Очень много, very many, a lot. The tone is conversational and slightly exasperated, as if someone is pointing out the obvious. If you want, I can also explain the nuance of the sentence «Nig с трубкой в руке приблизился к изваянию» is in Russian. Word for word, it translates roughly to a Negro with a pipe in his hand approached the statue. Breaking it down, Nig, an outdated, offensive term for a black person, like Negro in English, considered derogatory today. с трубкой в руке, with a pipe in his hand. Приблизился, approached. К изваянию, to the statue, or to the sculpture. Important note, the word nig. The phrase «прикоснувшись инструментом к одному из тонких пальцев статуи» is Russian. Literally, it translates to touching one of the thin fingers of the statue with an instrument, or more smoothly, having touched one of the statue's slender fingers with a tool, instrument. Breaking it down. Прикоснувшись, having touched, past adverbial participle, indicating a brief contact. Instrumentum, with an instrument tool, instrumental case, к одному из тонких пальцев, to one of the thin fingers, statui, of the statue. So the whole phrase describes someone lightly touching a statue's thin finger using some kind of tool. If you want, I can also suggest a more natural English phrasing that preserves the nuance and style of the original. Do you want? The Russian phrase «Он осторожно отделил его и» translates to English as «he carefully separated it and». Breaking it down, «он», he, «осторожно», carefully. «Отделил» equals separated or detached. «Его» equals it or him, depending on context. Here, likely it, equals and. The sentence seems unfinished, suggesting continuation. So it's part of a sentence where someone is carefully separating something. If you want, I can help figure out what exactly его refers to in context. It can change. The phrase «положив себе на ладонь» in Russian literally translates to having placed something on one's palm, or placing something on one's palm. Положив, a gerund of положить, meaning having placed or placing. Себе, for oneself or on oneself. На ладонь, on the palm of the hand. So in context, it usually describes someone holding something in their hand, typically the palm facing up. For example, он положил себе на ладонь монету. He placed a coin on his palm. If you want, I can also explain the nuance or. The Russian phrase «провел по нему серебристым обручем» literally translates to, open quote, ran or passed a silvery hoop over him, close quote. Breaking it down, провел, past tense of проводить, meaning to run, pass, lead, or conduct, по нему, over him or along him. Серебристым обручем, with a silvery hoop, обручи, hoop, ring, or circular band, серебристым, silvery, silver-colored. In context, it's likely descriptive or poetic imagery, suggesting something like a silvery ring of light moving over a person or object. Maybe moonlight, a magical effect, or some other shimmering circle. If you want, the Russian sentence «палец раскрошился словно глиняный» translates to English as «the finger crumbled as if it were made of clay». Breaking it down, палец, finger, раскрошился, crumbled, broke into pieces, словно, as if, like глиняный, made of clay. It's a vivid, somewhat dramatic metaphor, likely describing extreme fragility or injury, as if the finger was so weak it fell apart like clay.